Well, welcome to our next panel. I know you're still getting some coffee and stuff and sitting, but I'll go ahead and start. I am Chad Pivotow. I am Assistant Professor of Religion and Director of Liberal Studies at Texas Wesleyan University in Fort Worth. And by virtue of being listed first, I'll be moderating our panel here on session 2 on transformative intersections. Transformative. So we don't have the burden of history. We can just talk about transformation, and hopefully you will be transformed by the end of this. To my left is Nathan Eric Dickman, who's a PhD and Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Young Harris College. He researches in hermeneutic, phenomenology, philosophy of language, and comparative questions in philosophy of religions. He teaches a wide range of courses on topics such as existentialism, Islam, ethics, and the historical Jesus. And we also have Kent Anderson. He's the director of the Hess Center for Leadership and Service and the chair of engaged programs at Birmingham Southern College in Birmingham, Alabama. He has written and presented on faculty professional development and the implementation of effective educational and learning design. And we each have a chapter in the volume that we will be discussing. And with that, I will send it over to Kent to give his good words.
Say a word or two. Hello, is that all right? So I'm glad to be here. I'm excited to be here, and I've already learned a good bit about the way theologians and sort of people that work in this domain talk, and that's been exciting for me. My usual sort of activity is around teaching composition. I teach some leadership and leadership development courses, and so that's what I do. And a number of years ago, when I first got to Birmingham Southern College, I was invited to participate in our January term project at Glide Memorial United Methodist Church. And so I was invited to participate there through the director of our service learning program. I've since been more involved in our service learning program, and I've done that project now 7 times. In fact, I was just back this past January 2018, to work with a group of students there. And so what I talk about in the chapter is my own kind of professional intersection with that project, and what spending 3 weeks at Glide sort of did to me, how it sort of changed me, and sort of how working with those students transformed me, to take the chapter heading. I hadn't until just a few moments ago when I was chatting with Chad thought about it as a conversion story, but in some ways that's an accurate description of it. And so I guess what I sort of relay in the chapter is how I'm different as a result of working with a place like Glide. I don't know how much you know about Glide. There's a lot of things to say about who they are and their founding and what they do. They're one of the largest service providers in San Francisco. So they have a meals program. They have a harm reduction program where they work with drug users to provide them with resources to safely use drugs. They have recovery programs. They hold what are called speak out sessions, where people can get up to tell their story and sort of do speak out sessions and do that. When we go, as part of our January term project, we usually read a little bit of background from them. We read a book called Beyond the Possible by Cecil and Janice. They're the 2 founders of Glide. Cecil was the founding pastor there in the 1960s and sort of started to do much more radical inclusiveness, to sort of think about themselves as radically inclusive and to bring everyone into the church. A key story that he tells, that you'll hear them tell on a regular basis, if you read almost anything about Glide, you'll hear the story of taking down the cross. And how one day when he was in the church, someone comes in and talks about a drug user, a sort of person from the street, comes in to talk about the presence of the cross and how that really represents for this person oppression, marginalization. And so Cecil realizes, if it's going to be open and inclusive as he dreamed from his childhood, he's got to remove that cross. And so we hear those kinds of stories. If you go to the sanctuary today, there's still no cross there. They do what they call a celebration on Sundays, which celebrates sort of life, love, people's lives, people's stories. A frequent sort of occurrence at those events is for someone to get up and tell their story and talk about how I am Glide. And sort of participate in that. They see themselves as radically inclusive in that way. They talk about unconditional love. and sort of how to get unconditional love. Every time I've gone on the project, the theme of our particular group has been different. In the incident that I relay in the chapter, it was from last year, 2017, the theme for that group really was around purpose. So as we would meet with senior pastors there, as we would meet with representatives from Glide, they have a lot of different staff. They have a civic engagement and sort of outreach staff. They have their coordinating staff for all the volunteer programs. We get to meet with an individual who is trans, African American, has been, sort of came to Glide as someone who struggled with identity and sort of using, and now runs their speak out sessions and runs some recovery circles. We usually get a session with Terry to sort of talk about that. In fact, we did this last January as well, but a year ago we met with Terry multiple times in the speak out sessions. And so the chapter partly relays then what happened to me as a result of that. Which part to begin with? The short version, to tell the story, I offer two contrasting cases. One is of me before I came to Birmingham Southern College. One is of me in 2017, sitting with a student. In the first case, I'm working at a community college. I'm in Northern Virginia. I have a student in the class. It's my writing class. And in the class, I want to talk, on that particular day, I wanted to talk about organizational structure, how it is you might sort of shape an essay, how you might forecast the features of an essay. And so as an example, I use Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. To me, this is, on the face of it, just an example of how to structure a piece, how to forecast it, how to make the argument. In the essay, Russell really sort of argues against Christianity, describes why one couldn't believe in God, what the arguments against that, why first cause arguments don't hold water, why the argument for morality doesn't hold water, these kinds of things, and then impugns the character of Christ. And really says Christ is contradictory. He doesn't really do what he says. He doesn't sort of hold true to who he is. That's the substance of the essay. But in the class, ostensibly, I'm interested in trying to teach the shape or the form of it. But what happens to me is I end up after class talking with a student from Romania. He tells me he's an Orthodox Christian, and he wants to engage me about the argument that Russell is making. And I remember looking back, this is some 20 years ago now. I remember looking back at that moment and thinking, what a missed opportunity I had. Because mostly what I did was advocate for Russell's view and tried to argue Russell's position. At the time, I still identify as a non-believer. I wouldn't say that I feel the force of religious belief. That's what I would say now. At the time, I probably, and this is why it's an interesting way to think about it as a conversion story, at the time I probably saw my obligation to convert people to a non-believing orientation. At the time, I couldn't see how one could hold on to a view of a religious deity. It just didn't make sense to me. Reason, evidence, support, logic just wasn't there. How could you be so foolish? And so I felt compelled, really, to try to make that case. That was in my personal life as well. But as I started to teach people, and as I started to work with people, I knew it really kind of ran counter to my professional obligation as an educator to force people to adopt or adhere to a particular view. That didn't make sense to me as a teacher. And so I started to feel a tension in my own life around what I was trying to do as an educator, help people liberate their own minds, get better at thinking, express themselves, articulate their own sort of thoughts and ideas, and that sort of compulsion or sense of converting people. So there I was. That was me 20 years ago. Then I show up at Birmingham Southern College, a place where initially, this is not in the chapter, where initially I remember getting the offer for the job and looking, sort of scouring the website and saying, well, this is a Methodist-affiliated institution. Surely they're all busy converting people, right? Turned out that was not the case at all once I started to talk to people and meet people there. And I was asked to join the San Francisco project. The director of the service learning program at the time said, "Hey, Kent, some students really think you'd be a good match for this. Would you like to join?" And I had the luxury that first time that I went that I didn't actually have to lead it. I didn't have to be on point for facilitating conversations. I didn't have to be on point for figuring out who we were going to talk to at Glide, what was going to happen there. Instead, I got to just go along. There was another professor along. Nancy Davis was her name. She's now at another institution, but she was there. She'd been on the project before. And I tell this story from that first experience. I remember her standing, facilitating our conversation. We're cramped we're staying at a youth hostel, and we're sort of cramped in the space where we're sleeping. So there's bunks there. We're sort of scattered around the room on these bunks. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but there was a moment when she said, in my faith tradition, we think it's important too. And that triggered for me in that moment, I remember it, thinking it isn't necessary for me to get you to believe any particular thing. In fact, there may be something more valuable in me trying to stand where you stand for a spell to see where that takes us. This overlapped with work I was doing in my writing classes. I had encountered a kind of writing pedagogical person who talks about the believing and doubting game. And so I talk about the believing and doubting game here. The believing and doubting game and the sort of process of believing and doubting really means school teaches us how to doubt. One of the key things that school likes to get us to do is to be critical, to learn how to interrogate a position, to find the propositions in it where there's contradictions, to pull those apart, to quote unquote think critically. I mean, that's what most people think about when they think critically, is to examine something for the underlying assumptions and then figure out how those might be different and then move to another place. What Peter Elbow was helping me see as I was trying to teach writing, and I saw it intersect with, that was my concern about my professional identity, is that I wanted to try to teach the believing game. And when Nancy said that in that moment, I saw an overlap of she's basically saying, play the believing game. In my faith tradition, it's important for us too. So take just a moment and play the believing game with me. Just suspend doubt and believe with me for the moment to see where it takes us. And so that emphasized for me what Elbow was trying to teach with the believing game. When I play the believing doubting game in class, we basically take two propositions. Or you take a proposition and you say, well, when you believe it, you say, what would the world look like if this were true? What else would we have to believe? What would it feel like? What would it mean for our actions? The doubting game is just as important. If this weren't true, what would the world look like? That's easy enough. One proposition we've been hearing kind of this morning over and over again. What if it looks like that underneath it all, we're really kind of all pointing to the same fundamental thing, that chapter 2, pluralism, I think that you were just talking about. Well, okay, let's believe that. What if that's true? Right? What would be the case? What would that look like? What would it mean for our actions? But what if it's false? Right? And part of what happens in chapter 3 is someone starts to doubt it a little bit, right? Well, that actually leads us to some things that we might not want, right? And so it's that suspension that turned out to be important for me. So that's the rough version of my story. I go on in the chapter to try to connect it up to some other pedagogical approaches that I think are important, that start to see the whole person, not just the cognitive mind or the brain, and I think then overlap with some other things. But that's the rough sketch of the story that I try to tell about myself and how it is I wound up at a place like Glide and what it kind of did for me and how to work with students. Because the second story that I tell in comparison to the story with the student from Romania at the community college is a student from a year ago, January, where I'm sitting in a Starbucks, as it turns out. I'm sitting at a Starbucks with a student who needs to write a critical reflection essay. She's really fairly fundamentalist in her faith orientation and her religious orientation. The part I don't tell in there, she voted for Donald Trump, right? And so she comes from a place that wouldn't resonate for me at all. But we had gone to a speak out session. And in the speak out session, the African-American trans woman who talks about, I don't tell this in the story, but talks about things that sound very illicit. She makes clear that she came to Glide and went to a recovery session because she was excited by the guy that was going to lead the recovery session. She thought, this is going to go well for me to get there. So she's telling this story that's pretty illicit. But the student that I'm sitting next to is moved by the speak out session leader. And so she's trying to find a way to reconcile that with her own story. She's trying to figure out, how am I going to tell a story to my parents where I feel like Jesus and the Lord are talking to me through a trans woman, right, in this church? How am I going to tell that story back home to my friends and my family, right? And rather than I felt my old self say, gods don't talk through people, right? But rather than go there and doubt, I said, what if I believe? And what if I work with you to explore what your options are? And so I sat with her, sort of next to her, rather than try to set myself up in opposition to her. So those are the two counter stories that I try to tell at the front of the chapter, is that moment sitting next to that student who had an openness about her that I had already really come to respect, who had a kind of unusual life experience herself. She's adopted, but was adopted late in her life and still knows her birth mother. And so she had these own sort of odd experiences for herself. And I'd really come to respect the openness that student had expressed. So it made it easy to believe with her that was what was happening, and think about the implications on her own terms rather than on my terms. What would that look like? What would be the terms for her that would sort of mean for that? What would that mean? So we got to explore all kinds of things that I did care about. Gender. We got to explore power. We got to explore all kinds of stuff that on any given day I would think are important, right? So, all right, that's my story. I've probably taken my full 5.
Thank you, Kent. Eric?
10 minutes?
Yeah.
All right.
We have till noon.
Okay. All right. So, hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with everybody, and I'm so glad to be part of these conversations. I'm approaching this as a scholar of religious studies who does comparative study of religion, who uses hermeneutic phenomenology as my theoretical method. Okay. So, instead of being a personal story, this is going to be really abstract theory. So sorry. But hopefully it'll be useful. To me, it sounds like I'm shouting. So if you're, all right. So I've got a write up here, but the title is just saying prioritizing questioning or questions for religious literacy. And it's part of this hermeneutic phenomenological model by which we can empathetically reconstruct the other, or in other words, suspend our doubt in order to compassionately or charitably understand the other. Because I, as a comparative religious studies scholar, wants to know, how can I respect the particularity of multiple religious traditions as a teacher, right? Because when I teach a class on Islam, I want to teach Islam both charitably and critically, and not merely critically, right? So how do I do that without being Muslim? How do I do that without being a Scientologist? How do I do that without being an atheist, right? To represent these varying ways of life, whatever we want to call them. So my approach is this. I work in the religious studies department, but I'm very involved with religious life. I'm the advisor for the humanist group. I'm the advisor for the Buddhist group. I was the advisor for the fundamentalist Christian group until they realized what I was doing. And when there were a number of Jewish students that were trying to start a Jewish student group, I was the person they were coming to, because they're like, of all the people that could be advisors, we would like you to do it. And I'm happy to do that, although I feel like I don't ever sleep and don't have a family and don't get paid enough. All right, so for me, the biggest problem as somebody who's an advocate for religious diversity, both as a scholar and as a participant in religious life, I think the biggest problem on a religiously affiliated campus is what I want to call religious prejudice. Just like racism, sexism, all these, religionism is another form. But it's not explicit persecution as much as a kind of placated, contented exclusivism. In that when you have an institution that's religiously affiliated, it's hard for the religious majority to empathize with the others. And that's the part, to me, that I want to try to work within, and I think this diagnostic kind of theoretical opportunity can get us there. And so that seems to me to be the problem. This it's a, you know, I call it like placating students in a youth group mentality, where they just, it's Christianity all over the place, at least on my campus, and with no sympathy for people who may not participate in those forms of life. So there's that dimension of it. And then the other dimension of it is, okay, so how can we maintain a religious affiliation, not necessarily identification, affiliation, while at the same time being a liberal arts college? And I don't think you can serve two masters. I think you have to choose one or the other, and I choose liberal arts. So here's where I want to go with this. So for me, how I got into this was just looking for ways that the United Methodist documents talk about how to deal with religious diversity. And so, for instance, in the handbook for UMC-affiliated colleges, it states, and I quote, "Rather than either isolating faith as something outside of the curriculum or mandating a particular set of beliefs, the United Methodist-related colleges and universities provide courses and co-curricular programs that," and this is the key phrase for me, "that enable students to delve into questions of meaning and purpose," which to me is a radically different phrase than truth. Like, my proposition is a corresponding accurate representation of the facts. Delving into questions of meaning and purpose to me is quite a different kind of question. Okay, so this is something that's promoted by the United Methodist Church. And so there's a number of guidelines for colleges that are affiliated with the UMC. And so here's a particularly significant one, and I want to quote the exact wording again. This guideline, I don't know which number it is now. UMC affiliated colleges allows faculty and students to, and this is the quote, allows faculty and students to explore the place of religious belief and practice, and specifically the intellectual dimensions of the Christian faith, in all academic disciplines and co-curricular activities. Okay, so questions of meaning and purpose, allowing faculty and students to explore the place of religion in all academics and all academic disciplines and co-curricular activities. So that means, to me, no one has to, because we're allowed to. That also means we're studying the place, that is, the way that we talk about it in religious studies, we call it religion in culture. So we're not studying my religion. It may be my religion, but whether it's mine or not is not really the issue. It's how is religion related to economics? What are the psychological or neurological benefits of meditation, Buddhist meditation, or prayer, or whatever? I can ask these kind of social, scientific, humanistic, existential, phenomenological, psychological, not theological questions about religion. And I say it on purpose, the not theological questions, not confessionally theological questions, let's put it that way. So that's the place of religious belief and practice. And it can be Christian faith if you want it to be, but it could also be any other religion. You can study Scientology all you want on a Methodist campus. In all academic disciplines, meaning if for some reason you as a chemistry professor can somehow work it into your research that religion is somehow important in there, you can do that. Or if you're a chemistry professor and you realize, well, I don't really get to talk about religion in those classes, I think I'm going to join the anime club. And in the anime club, the co-curricular anime club, maybe we'll talk about religion there. So you can do it anywhere on the campus. It doesn't have to be, but okay, all right. So now that's kind of the setup. Now I want to talk, this is where it gets more theory oriented. So I want to shift to, if we're promoting questions of meaning and purpose, what is a question and what is meaning? And so I want to lay that out. I've been working on this in my research, basically. What is a question and what is meaning? And I just want to lay this out briefly, and then I'll call it. So for me, the axiom is to understand a question is to ask it. To understand meaning is to understand it as an answer to a question. So for me, when I think about myself as a professor, when I'm teaching Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, if my students aren't asking the question to which Aristotle is responding, then the students just see a pile of sentences and are like, what am I supposed to know for the exam? But if they understand the question to which Aristotle is trying to answer, then they see Aristotle's contribution as one among many possible responses to that question. And if the students aren't actually asking that question themselves, then there's no understanding. Understanding is only achieved when we both ask the same question. And if we're not asking the same question, then we're, like we were talking about earlier, talking past one another. Are we even talking about the same topic, and how do we make sure that we are? So now we're talking about how do we even get discrete about sentences and remember that a complete thought consists of a subject and a predicate, so that the subject is the same, the topic identified by the subject is the same subject. And how do we know which predicates, which sentential subjects are in our semantic fields that we're trying to even understand with one another? So when I teach comparative study of religions, I need to figure out how to get students to be able to ask Buddhist questions so that they can understand Buddhist responses to those Buddhist questions. And if they're coming from a background where they're like, how do you get saved in Buddhism? You can't ask that question. Come on. Or, all right. So in the chapter, I pick on a president of a Methodist institution who says, here's the big questions, and it's all Christian predicates. And I say, that's not liberal arts. You are restraining the imagination of the predicative possibilities for the freedom of thought that we really need if we are an open campus that's merely affiliated. And so there are people who challenge whether institutions like that should be accredited as colleges. Be a seminary. Are you a liberal arts college? Then why is there the restriction on the fundamental language of intelligibility such that everything, right, like we're going to study world religions in dialogue with the Christian faith because I'm going to translate all religions into Christianity and then I'll understand it. Instead of, I'm going to make sure that I learn new languages so that I can actually understand them on their terms. I should probably stop. I've been going on for long enough, right? Okay.
Good. Well, thank you, Eric. Now it's time for me to offer my perspective from my chapter. I think the volume as a whole does a wonderful job, even though focusing on Methodism does a wonderful job of bringing in multiple perspectives and multiple dynamics. And I'm just pleased that my particular panel here also brings in the diverse perspectives of white men who both have beards and do not. So I'm pleased for that.
Which one am I?
So my chapter is how the story of Job may help us all get along. And I do a lot in the chapter, so I'm only going to focus on a few things. I'm going to tell you some aspects of it that aren't in the chapter. One being just about the title. The title, How the Story of Job May Help Us All Get Along. It's basically childhood Chad talking to you, saying, can't we all just get along? As an adult, to say that, it carries a little bit of the anemic white liberal sort of just can't we all get along, and it diffuses a lot of things, right? It doesn't bring the requisite analysis of systemic power, systemic privilege and oppression, and thus a power analysis. To say, oh, can't we all get along, does have a little bit of the ring of just all lives matter, right? And to make such moves can discount the real attention and awareness we need to be paying to the dynamics in the real world before we can actualize or bring about a real condition in which all lives really do matter, or we could possibly all get along. Nevertheless, I do want us all to get along, and I do believe that all lives matter. And so there is this sort of naivete here I'm trying to honor, but bring into a fullness through a critical analysis that doesn't relieve all the tensions. So I specialize in comparative mystics. One could identify a relatively stable pattern of a lot of mystical paths, which would be to move from the naivete, move from ignorance into knowledge and have an awareness. But that's not it, just it. And I don't think that's our job as educators or our job on college campuses, is to simply deliver knowledge. I think we need to move. Knowledge needs to be not something that's merely mental. It needs to be felt. But moreover, it needs to be embodied and lived in the world. So it needs to flow out. But I think knowledge also should be transcended by attaining some sort of a level of learned ignorance, which mystics will testify to, that knowing is good, but in a great many ways, unknowing is better. And so embracing mystery, embracing contradictions, embracing questioning are things that really help us all on our paths. So every time Ibu yesterday was talking about the initiation into conflict. I kept thinking, well, that's what a lot of mystics, to my mind, talk about. And that's also what I mean when I talk about critical thinking in classrooms. And so I tell my students that my job is not to care for their souls, if we have a soul. Though I do care for their souls, but that's not my job. My job is to train you to be critical thinkers. And I think critical thinking can be soul-enhancing, faith-enhancing, but I tell them that's their work to do. My work is in the classroom at least, is to train you to be critical thinkers and to engage in questioning. And so those points are sort of wrapped into the story, or into my chapter here, but I don't make them quite as explicitly as I just was. But the chapter is framed around the story of Job, but a particular resource in the story of Job from the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament. But Job is also a figure that Jews, Christians, and Muslims will all look to some extent. So I was drawing on this story because it crosses boundaries or intersects, at least among the Abrahamic traditions, to a great extent. But I wanted to take the story and focus on really the people who are oftentimes framed as the villains of the story, or the example of what not to do. But we forget that there's a moment where they do everything right. The bulk of the actual text is taken up with them being really wrong and really dumb, giving all the different, arguing with Job to argue a point, but not to understand or empathize. I think empathy might be a commonality among the three of us. But they spend most of the time just giving the bad theological responses to theodicy, to the mystery of suffering. And they give the bad responses for most of the time. But before they open their mouths, they do these things. And so just the story, I'll go ahead and read it to get us all on the same page. Each of them, so this is Job, the second chapter. Each of them set out from his home. They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Right? And Job, a classic story of suffering, of unearned suffering, of just great calamity and suffering befall him, though he is a righteous man. He loses everything, even his health. And the friends go through this process, which I identify as a possible process for interfaith relations and for interfaith work on college campuses. The process, as if we tease it out of that text I just read, would be to know, go, gather, recognize, cry, and share silence. And so in the chapter, I explore various dynamics of that, but I wanted to focus on a couple of things here that I thought might be useful for our discussions together, and then we'll open it up to what did you call them, a speak out session? They were called, yeah, so we'll speak out a little, and then everybody go to speak to each other. On page 80 and 81, I tease out some more definitions of pluralism that when I begin in my teaching to discuss pluralism with students, I begin with a simple distinction between descriptive and prescriptive. Right? Descriptive is simply explaining the way things are. Right? Whatever these things are that we call religions today, right? These diverse systems of human cultures, there are a lot of them, right? And they're messy and they're multiple. And we need to just be able to talk about that reality, right? So we need to be able to describe it, right? They are plural, or there is pluralism in the world in regard to religious and faith dynamics. So that's descriptive pluralism. Prescriptive pluralism is what we're oftentimes, most often I think, talking about in this context of interfaith work. But that prescribes pluralism as a virtue, right? As an opportunity. Possibly as a challenge, but that challenge being somehow turned into a positive. So it prescribes pluralism, to engage pluralism, to engage difference, to engage diversity as a generative process. But the ways that gets prescribed are very different, and I tease out two different types, one being contributive, the other being ascendant. Right? We've touched on both of these. Ibu Patel where is he? Is he not out of the room right now? No. Oh, well. He's a good representative. He's the representative I pull out of contributive pluralism. Contributive pluralism could be the shared. This is on page 81. The shared collective effort to embrace different opinions and peoples while persistently striving to form a more perfect union. That's prescriptive pluralism of the participatory democracy of the United States. But more generally, it's hearing diverse perspectives and having vibrant contributions from various communities helps us forge a brighter path ahead because the new ideas and additions might always be better. Any person or community willing to contribute to creating a better future, Patel argues, should be embraced not in spite of their differences, but because of them. We do not have to agree on all matters, to work together side by side, volunteering at a food pantry, cleaning up a stream, or cooperating on ending sex trafficking. The ascendant version of pluralism, however, prescribes believing in a more ascendant truth than any of the particular traditions claim. Pluralism in this mode means embracing an unknowable universal sacred of which the individual traditions preach only partial approximations. Advocates of this type of pluralism hope we can all get along by accepting all religious worldviews as reflections of the more ascendant truth, albeit refracted through each one's particular limited perspectives. So either a pluralism that sees differences as a positive because we can always learn from the other, and in working out those differences and struggling, we can come up with creative options we would not have otherwise come up with alone. Or a type of pluralism that tries to water down difference, right? And tries to move above and beyond particularity and to try to embrace some sort of a unknowable other. Now, I love that ascendant pluralism as well, but I try to argue for the contributive. I do that in the section where I'm talking about knowing of what knowing different traditions could be. But the section before that is where I talk about going out of our comfort zones. And then I come around in the end of the chapter, that two types of pluralism I flesh out with a particular story in the classroom of a fundamentalist student of my older woman, had children, and her deep faith had sustained her through a great many difficulties. We actually brought Eboo Patel to Texas Wesleyan. He talked. She came for the extra credit to get to actually hear his talk, and she came away from it angry. She came away from hearing Patel preach contributive pluralism scared, because she feared it was watering down her own faith. But because she was a good student, and because she was in my class, and because we were reading Patel and discussing it critically, we spent a whole semester working on these things. And by the end of the semester, she had committed to Patel's version of pluralism, even though she didn't have the ears to hear it. Because when she heard him talking about contributive pluralism, she actually heard him talking about ascendant pluralism. She heard him asking her to give up her faith in Christ as the way, the truth, and the life, and to embrace him merely as a way to the truth. And for her to think of that as merely a way disabled the faith that had been empowering her. And by the end of the semester, however, she came to a perspective of being able to appreciate that hearing from others and listening to others might cause her to grow in her own faith. As Max Mueller said, to know one is to know none. But it took a process. Right? She had to acquire the ears to hear. The nuances of the language, so some of it's just simply education, but also I think a transformative process. And I'll end there. You can read the chapter for its own particularities. But quickly, let's go through the three of us and toss out questions, and then you can speak out with each other at your individual tables, and then we'll come back together again for a collective discussion of these issues. So, Ken.
I think you just hit, I guess if I had a question for you all that emerges from me just listening to these sort of pieces, how do we acquire the ears to hear? How do we develop the capacity to sort of hear?
Can't hear you.
Sorry. I guess what emerges for me sort of listening to these again, you said empathy, but I'm also thinking, how do we acquire the ears to hear? Right? How is it that we develop the skills, the capacity, the ability really to start to hear things on other people's terms, whether that's either a collective people's terms or an individual person's terms. Like, how do we develop those skill sets? It seems to me that's a fundamental practice for doing liberal arts education. It's easy to see that when we imagine what is it to think like a sociologist, what is it to think like a scientist, what is it to think like an English professor. It's easy for us to kind of do it that way. But what do we do in those other areas of how do we develop those skill sets and that capacity so that someone has the ears to hear, has the empathy to sit in that position, has the capacity, in my language here is how do we really cultivate the ability to really play the believing game, right? Not just play it kinda, but really play it. That's the question that emerges for me listening to the three of us go.
I have one quick question and then a harder question. I want you to try to figure out what year it is truly, what year is it for real?
I do that question in my classes.
And the other question that I have is, can you serve two masters, both liberal arts and your religion, or do you have to choose between one or the other?
And for my question that I would throw out for you to possibly consider would be, I framed all the stuff I wanted to say about interfaith work around this resource of the friends in Job who are usually cast as being the example of what not to do. but I found a moment where they're doing the great thing. Because remember, when they show up, they just give their presence to Job for 7 days and 7 nights. They sit with him in silence, right? And they visibly grieve and mourn with him. Then they open their mouths and things get messed up. But they gave their presence. And so I pulled that out as a resource to help with interfaith work, thinking it was maybe possibly somewhat creative. So my question for you would be, what unexpected resources might, whether it's in your histories, your institutional traditions, your own lives, or pop culture, what unexpected resources might be mined for interfaith work? What unexpected resources might be mined for interfaith work? So talk amongst yourselves for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll come back together for a group discussion. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay, Mark's got the microphone back there to help you. So now we would like to hear from you and give you an opportunity to ask questions or voice your responses. It can be as simple as sharing what you talked about.
I think you may have converted all of them.
I like it. My student helps out here. Thanks, Julian.
I think the last thing we were just talking about, specifically for that first question about how do we develop the ears to hear, there were at least 2 things that I thought about in response to that question. One of them being, and this is based on some of the work that I'm currently working on as a senior project and really beyond that. As I think about the idea that I was telling them I had a really horrible experience working at a church at one point, but I learned some really great things. There was one thing that stood out. There was this pastor, and it was extremely ironic because he was a very defensive person. But he used to tell me, because he thought that I was argumentative, that I should seek to understand rather than to be understood. Mm-hmm. And though it was ironic, because of the source it was coming from, the wisdom was still wisdom, right? And I think about if I approach conversations with the idea to understand the other person rather than for them to understand me, then I'm at what may be the base level of transformation for both of us. If I can start there. I can't do anything about what the other person does. The other side, addition to that, I've been working on a project that's dealing with how the power of weakness can be a resource to transform dominance and abusive power. And this idea about weakness being a strength to be cultivated, if we can find the strength to be weak or to be vulnerable. If I can meet those conversations with this capacity of weakness that transforms dominance and defense and negative, violent conflict, coupled with this idea of seeking to understand rather than to be understood, then I think transformation at least starts, even if I don't leave with my mind changed. I am changed because of the experience. I'm better for it. And I think in that sense, that level sets the entire conversation, and we are all better for it. So,
good. Thank you, John.
thank you.
Yeah. So if possible, maybe a few voices on the same model as last night. Yeah.
Of the 3 questions, the one that really jumped out at me, because it's on my to-do list, is what year is it, and how can you serve 2 masters? This time of the year at Vanderbilt, our office works in a more complicated way each year in devising a religious holy days calendar that we consult with rabbis and imams, and just to make sure that every particular holiday for the next academic year, starting in fall 2018 through next spring, is accurately listed, and certainly those holidays that are set by the lunar calendar, we have to asterisk and say, oh, by the way, the observance really happens the night before. And it gets very complicated even for a very well-educated faculty. And so that's always the question.
But it'll say 2017, 2018, or 2018,
Yes.
2019, right?
Yeah,
With
translated
these other-
into this
with
other.
these other holidays,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it does, and
Yeah.
it's
The
embedded in a
fundamental discourse of intelligibility is still Christianity.
Exactly. That's you're exactly right, and that's what I said at the table, that it's all still embedded in a Gregorian calendar. But then the question is, just like this past week, once that calendar is established and the provost approves of it and then disseminates it to all of the deans, and then the deans to the faculty, then we have protocols and guidelines that we say this is the way this needs to be engaged with students in question. And so it's always a question of which master do you serve. That is, a student will come to a chemistry teacher and say, look, I need to observe Yom Kippur, and it's coinciding with a midterm exam. Can I take it a day later? Or
Why is the chemistry professor even having a class on Yom Kippur, though?
that's where
Right?
we're
Why do they have to out themselves?
right, and that's where we are right now. So I think it's a matter of us being able to educate our faculty better about the plethora of religious holy days, which are very seldom, if ever, Christian holy days, because even our academic calendar takes all that into account. So I'm just saying that these are very good questions. I don't know how to solve them, but I think as it gets more complicated, and as I get drawn into these conversations with deans and faculty members about what do you recommend that I do, we're able to really help them to nuance what that means. Also, aside from the academics, this applies to residential education. On our campus, we are all going to at Vanderbilt residential colleges with faculty and residents, and so there's a lot of extracurricular learning and activities that are set around kind of cultural times of the year. So two fall semesters back, we had one of our biggest residential colleges plan an Oktoberfest, which was really required of all their residents, right in conjunction with Rosh Hashanah. And these students were really required, to pay for the food and to be there. And so this was not a religious, bias by the residential life people. It was just they were oblivious. So they haven't done that again.
Wait,
but,
oblivious is not a bias?
well, yeah, I guess you're right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't intentional. It wasn't intentional.
Just convenient.
It was just convenient.
Yeah.
It's not intent. Oh, okay.
So anyway, I've made a statement more than raised a question, but whatever advice you can give as I try to move this along.
I have all the answers
Yeah.
in the book. Just read my.
Just read the chat. Yeah.
Sure. One of the things I didn't say in our group, but I was struck by the unexpected resources that might be used for interfaith work. One of the things I'm in the process of working with some faculty, and this is not for those of you that maybe do chaplaincy work, this would not be maybe sounds so revolutionary, but I'm working with a practical ethicist and a sociology professor, a leadership professor, and then an academic dean to do basically a meaning making and purpose retreat, and then do curriculum, and it's based off of the Purposeful Graduate, that research. But that's for me, pretty fascinating way to begin to talk through interfaith, talk through meaning making and purpose, take some of the kind of basic questions that humans have and students have. And so I'm curious to see how, I've been trying it for a couple years to see how it goes. I finally have traction with faculty who are not religious faculty at all. And so that's, for me, a really interesting way to approach meaning making and purpose in the academy through my Office of Religious Life.
I love that response to the unexpected resources. That any efforts to reframe the question, I think creative things happen. Oftentimes it's framed in such a Protestant way of, right, what do you believe, right? But as soon as like, well, what's your purpose? Or how do you want to live? Or what problems do you want to solve in the world? That reframing of the question can get us a lot different responses and help us move forward.
So Chad, this is for you. I am curious about your thoughts on how the three comforters came and sat down with Job and seemed to be so empathetic. And then they start reaming him out, right? And they, Job, fess up. What have you done? You have to have done something. And Job seems to be responding by saying, if I've done something, it's fairly minor because it's not obvious to everyone, and the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime, right? And so, and then you get to Elihu at the end, and he is just brutal. Like, Job, you got off easy for how wicked you actually are, and you just need to fess up here. And I'm curious as to your thoughts as to, like, do you have any thoughts about what the shift there? I mean, in the first part, they're empathetic, but their empathy doesn't seem to match with their theology that comes later that seems to mitigate against empathy.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the chapter I say, when the time came, the friends would have better served Job by adding action rather than words to their silence. They did not need to discuss theology in order to care for his wounds, rebuild his house, and work to restore his livelihood. Practices of silence, paired with practical action, can counter violence and foster peace. So yeah, I mean, you could imagine maybe they were just doing the bad conversational technique of not actually empathizing, right? They were sitting in silence, just awaiting their turn to talk. They weren't actually contemplating, right? They were sitting next to, but not sitting with Job, right? They weren't really, that's, I think, a reading that's justified by their responses and the rest of the chapter. But in terms of my life and fast pace and everything, it's hard for me to imaginatively even get into the space of what it would be like to sit for 7 days, 7 nights in silence with a dear friend who was suffering, right? The work that would require. I don't know, maybe at the end of all that, I'd be pretty ready to talk a lot. I don't know. But I still think that 7 days and 7 nights of nothing but their presence was a pretty nice gift.
Thank you all very much. The question that I was pondering was the question of, can we serve two masters in particular? And I'm particularly thinking about the notion of there are multiple kinds of knowledge that exists within the world, and we operate kind of interchangeably with these kinds of knowledge, and we use the same word, knowledge, or I know this thing, and we're actually talking about radically different somethings. So, for example, the way that I typically frame it is that we know that, we know how, and we know who. And so, for example, I know that, and this is what we talked about at the table, is that if we're talking about the violin, like I know lots of information about violins, and even the techniques. I could describe to you techniques and how they play. It doesn't mean I can play the violin, but I could be an expert in the knowledge around violins. I even be an expert in how violins are made, the construction. It may be an expert in the history of them. But that's a bit of data that I contain, and so that's that kind of knowledge. Then a how kind of knowledge is you learn how to be a violinist. And so you could be a great violinist and have learned the techniques and the skills and be proficient at them, but you know nothing about that knowledge. You have no knowledge of violinists, other violinists, or history of the violin, or how violins are made, or why they work well. So it's different kinds of knowledge, but both of you could say, I know a lot about violin, and you'd be correct in answering the question, but two different kinds of knowledge. There's another kind of knowledge, which is the know who. And so by that I mean is like, what does it mean to be a violinist? And so that requires not only knowing how to play, but it requires the sense of being able to play in a community, so that I know how the violin works well in harmony with other sounds. And so that means I need to know who you are as another musician. I need to know who you are as an audience member, how you're going to hear this. So it's a different set of knowledge. So it's this how and this that and this who kind of knowledge. So they're different kinds of knowledge. And so I wonder that if when we're talking about what goes on in the classroom, we're describing to know that knowledge. So it's a whole bunch of that knowledge that we're trying to disseminate to people. But that what if the whole liberal arts institution is interested in who and how knowledge? So I'm just trying to say, is it possible to do all three, but one is sequestered in the classroom, or are they all bleed over to each other, or we can only be interested in one at a time in discrete places?
No.
Eric and I have had this conversation before.
Do you have some thoughts, Eric?
That compartmentalizes the classroom. I think the two masters are set up differently, where it's, are we trying to cultivate radically free individuals in terms of literally the liberal arts are the crafts of free people, like we were talking about earlier. How do you teach somebody, how do you facilitate somebody's realization of their freedom versus how do you cultivate disciples of Christ, which may or may not be compatible with radical freedom. And so to me, that's the two masters, not that knowledge versus how knowledge versus who knowledge, because one would hope that a classroom is both about cognitive outcomes, volitional or skill outcomes, and dispositional outcomes. Like if a classroom does not teach effective outcomes, teach to those, then it's a weak class. So one would hope that even classrooms are about the whole person, ideally. So I would want to make the two masters about, and this is where is a Methodist affiliated institution so free that when it gives a Christian service award, it's willing to give that award to a Shin Buddhist? If it can't even imagine that, this is where we were talking about are you a Buddhist? Can we imagine these alternative possibilities in such a way that we're not afraid of it, that we're courageously free to go, yeah, let's fucking do that, Whereas I think that we often are set in identity politics where we don't even really know our own religion, but we know we're supposed to show that we are this religion, and so we can't imagine an alternative form. You have that?
So, I mean, my reaction to what you just said is I like your description. And what I'm thinking about right now is what Polanyi talks about as tacit knowing versus explicit knowing. And often in school we talk about the explicit. In other words, can we sort of articulate explicitly what scientists know? But being a scientist isn't just about stating those things. We know more than we can say, is Polanyi's language. We know more than we can say. There's a feel for it. It's easiest to see this when you talk about driving a car. You can read all the manuals about how to drive a car you want. You can even watch other people drive a car and describe them accurately. But that doesn't mean you know how to drive a car. You have to have a feel for how to get in the vehicle, know how the gear shift works, know how the handles work, know how the rearview mirror sort of operates. So you have to have a feel for that, a sort of tacit for it. That's one thing that I'm thinking of. Your reaction is powerful, and I think I once would have stood right next to you and said, yeah, I'm with you. But I hear in it, the notion of freedom doesn't make sense to me in that way. So I wanted to revise my question after I heard you respond to it. And all those dispositions, I think, are accurate. Like, how do you learn to understand before you're worried about being understood? But I guess my real question isn't just how do we develop those ears, what are the necessary conditions to make that possible? What are the necessary conditions that allow that to happen? We can go back to Mark's story and say all day long, like, you just couldn't hear. What was wrong with you? Psychologically, what was wrong with you? But to me, the inner doesn't make the behavior. The conditions, the systems make the behavior. What are the necessary conditions to bring that about? So if we want to talk about someone being liberated, and I wrote down one word on my own notebook that I didn't want to lose, choice. How does one choose?
I don't know.
What are the necessary conditions for choice? That's what freedom means to me. That's what liberation means to me.
No.
That's what liberation is about. How
free will. That's libertarianism. No.
What are the conditions that make it? Because systems enable and constrain. Systems enable and constrain. what are the systems that we put in place that enable people to make choices, to
Yes.
be cognizant about where they are and who they are?
That enable people to be like fully realized human beings.
But I don't know what that is.
But
Like,
is
I
it-
don't know what that is without putting conditions in place that allow me to first pre-describe what that is.
So then I think if we're going to do understanding, like to go all the way back to the first comment was, how do you know that you've successfully understood somebody unless you have at least a tacit or implicit theory of understanding where this is what successful understanding is, and I've met that criteria, and now I understand them.
Well,
And
the
so,
only-
like, as professors, we have to actually have criteria by which we assess student understanding. Are they successful or not successful at understanding Kant or Aristotle or whatever we're having them read? And you actually give them a grade. They are not successful under a C, right? Well, I mean, now with grade inflation, everybody gets an A. So we have criteria by which we distinguish understanding from misunderstanding. And so if once we have a theory
Who's
of
the
understanding,
we in your statement?
people who grade, people who give grades, that's all we
so
need.
So you're sort of, the pre-starting point is always within context of particular institutions where there's already particular boundaries and dynamics at work.
How do you know it's an institution
Noah,
if
did you
it's?
wanna- Yeah.
Well, I think I was going to say something very similar, which is the whole concept of a fully realized human being is itself a contingent and embedded notion. I mean, you can't.
But the phrase contingent embedded notion is itself a contingent embedded notion, in which case we don't have to like stick with this tension of particularity, universality. We don't have to be anti-universal. We can take universals for what they are, as useful regulative ideals. That they don't have to, right? Like, so somebody who's an anti-essentialist, let's say, like we don't want to essentialize other human beings, like we don't want to stereotype. So we become anti-essentialist. But then you're essentializing essence and saying essence is always this one way and it's really bad to ascribe essence to things. And so to really allow yourself to think through all the way the problem of essentializing is to become comfortable using the word essence in a playful way. That's the play, like the freedom to play versus the problem of needing a solution.
Well, sure. I mean, one of the things that's powerful about being in, look, what does higher
We're in
education?
conflict right now.
Well,
We're initiating people into conflict.
Yeah, part of what you get to do within a higher education institution or a higher education context is precisely the opportunity to suspend so you can make some deliberate choices. In other contexts, you don't have that. The situation constrains you. You have to make other choices.
As the moderator here, I'll intervene with the prerogative of leading us in where we began. I think Julian might have a good point to make here.
Well, one of the things that I was just thinking about where we're talking is I think it was a comment you were saying about how do I know that I fully understood this other person? I think I may not have even been explicit. I don't know if the goal is to understand so much as it is the process of pursuing understanding. In the same way that like we will never achieve a more perfect union, the goal is to pursue a more perfect union more than anything else. So what all I heard, and I'm sure this is because we've had to read a lot of Keller
Catherine Keller, that is.
in Dr. Pivotow's classes, is that all I heard was what needs to be said was process. Like it is the process of pursuing understanding the other person. If I endeavor to do that, I overwhelm my pursuit to be understood. I short circuit it altogether. Even if I'm trying to be understood, I will never achieve them fully understanding me. But if I'm
Do we understand other people or what they say? Like if we're trying to understand another person, I'll never become them. But if I try to understand what they say, I can be successful or not. Like right now, we can exchange discourse.
This
And so if
movement
we
of
try to
processing through understanding.
discourse-
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
We reached an understanding.
All right.
There you go.
You reached an agreement.
Now we
Which is
can-
all understanding is.
Pursue the conversation.
Because we're
We've
being
reached
told
the
that we have
agreement
to
of
stop.
continuing these
Institutions of
conversations over
power.
lunch, it sounds like, I think.
Well, thank you very much. So, thank you for our panel.
That's fun. Thank you.
That's fun.